In this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about the final aspect of the establishment of communist rule within China. And this is from the perspective of international foreign policy. And this is through the lens of the Korean War. Now, during the early stages of communism within the Chinese state, which is really from 1949 onwards, we see that the most important global event that takes place during this early period, and the most important global event that takes place that China is directly involved in, is the Korean War. Now, this lesson is going to take a brief outline to examine just the general idea and the motivation for the Korean War itself, just do a very, very brief overview of the conflict itself, and then we will start to look at the conflict and examine it through the lens of the Chinese involvement. We'll talk about the impact that it had on the Chinese citizens, we'll talk about the impact that it had on the Chinese economy, and we'll talk about the impact it had on Mao's position within the Chinese state. So, this also involves the further solidification and further purges that began to take place as a result of those propaganda campaigns that suggest that people were against the Korean War, for example. So the Korean War itself, it began on the 25th of June 1950. So it's what's quite important here is remember that the Chinese Civil War only ends in November 1949. So it's not even a year since the end of the Civil War and the establishment of communist rule that we see the beginning of the Korean War. And it begins on the 25th of June 1950 when the communist North Korea invades the capitalist South Korea. That's essentially the beginning of this conflict. And in response to this invasion, the United Nations, a coalition that was led by the United States, launched a military campaign to take back South Korea, as well as push the communists back as close to the Chinese border as they possibly could. And it was when the United Nations and the UN coalition began to force back North Korea and began to push the communist North Koreans all the way back up to near the Chinese border that Mao made the decision to intervene within the Korean system. And so China intervened. They joined the conflict on the side of the communist North Koreans and pushed the UN forces all the way back the other way. And the conflict would end in a stalemate with a ceasefire formally ending the hostilities in 1953. So when I said that this was a very brief overview of what the Korean War was and everything that took place, I meant it. That's all we're going to talk about in terms of the series of events that takes place for the Korean War. If you want to know more about the Korean War, we are going to be doing lessons for A-level history on the Cold War at some point, and as well some GCSE Cold War lessons too. But for now, that's all we're going to get for the Korean War. Now let's talk what's important for us and for this course, that is China's involvement within the Korean War. In terms of the prestige and what I've described here as the subsidiary benefits to the Communist Party, the war in Korea was very positive. So it helped enhance the national prestige of China, with the view of China on the world stage, because China had just gone up against the United States and a coalition of UN forces, of other states within the United Nations, and they had essentially fought them to a stalemate, which is obviously a very interesting and a very shocking, in some regards, way in which we see the international prestige of China on the world stage, because for the most part, China was seen as an impoverished country within Asia, and to suggest that China had the ability to do such a thing was actually quite shocking at the time. It also gave the CCP an excuse to purge more political opponents. We will talk about this more in a little bit, in more detail a little bit later on, but they labelled those who were opposed to the Korean War, or even those that weren't opposed to the Korean War but who they wanted to get rid of, anti-communist or capitalist sympathisers or South Korean sympathisers, etc., counter-revolutionaries. And as a result, they were able to be purged and sent off to the countryside or the Laogai system, etc., etc. You know the drill already. And it also helped unite the communist countries within the region. So there was a favourable view of Mao by Stalin and the USSR as a result of their involvement within the Korean War. We also see some more communist revolutionaries begin to take place within China as well, and within Indochina more specifically. And we will talk about the involvement when we examine the Vietnam War a little bit later on. But we see that generally it helped unite communist countries within the region. The main regional communist state that we can examine is, of course, the Soviet Union, the USSR. And there was also the benefit that was given from a societal perspective, because people within China themselves were encouraged to donate wages as part of the Resist America Aid Korea campaign. And the ways in which the Chinese government was able to frame the conflict as one of a people's war against the capitalist invaders was very interesting, because what it did was it helped enhance a sense of national pride and national unity among the society within China. So those are what I described as the subsidiary impacts of the Korean War, in terms of what they did to directly impact Mao himself, the Chinese Communist Party, and to establish further solidification within the Chinese Communist Party as well. What about the actual impact that it had on people? Well, the overall impact from the conflict and the intervention within Korea was very much negative. Of the around 3 million soldiers that were sent to Korea for the conflict, around 400,000 of them would die as a result. So China lost 400,000 soldiers as a result of the Korean War. The conflict itself also had dramatic and detrimental economic costs. It cost around 10 billion US dollars at the time. And this was given the context of the fact that China is not the kind of country that it is today. It was a very impoverished country still. It was still trying to develop commitments to provide better education services, better public spending, better spending on infrastructure as well. And so given the fact that we have a $10 billion cost to the Korean War itself, this adds further pressure to the Chinese economy and means that it was relatively unaffordable given these other commitments that Mao had made. There was also the fact that China was in no real fit state to enter into an international armed conflict at the time. Again, this is June of 1950 to around the time of 1953 that the Korean War takes place. Don't forget that China had just gone through the Japanese invasion of the country during World War II, and then after the Japanese invasion, we see the subsequent Chinese Civil War, which only ends in November 1949. So as a result of that, China was in no real fit state to enter into an international armed conflict, especially an armed conflict with the United States and UN coalition forces. So as a result of this, we see the fact that that China's economic the economic impact of the Korean War on China was detrimental, and the fact that it also led to nearly 500,000 deaths was also detrimental as well. And as I mentioned earlier, we do also see further purges taking place, which is why we can see and we can position the Korean War and China's intervention in the Korean War as a further solidification of both the communist establishment within China itself through purges, as well as China on the international stage. So in March 1950, Mao launched the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries, so slightly before the beginning of the Korean War itself. But this was a campaign that was designed to prevent any nationalist sympathizers from undermining the regime, as well as any who were sympathetic to the capitalist cause. And a result of this, being heightened during the Korean War, because they can use the Korean War as a justification to commit further purges, the end result was the forcing of many of the previously nationalist individuals. They all had to leave the country, as well as arrests of many Christian missionaries as well. They saw missionaries who were Christian as those who were essentially capitalist and Western, because that's where Christianity sort of flourished within the globe at the time, compared to within the Far East, which is where China is, where Christianity isn't as prevalent as other religions. So as a result, we see Christian missionaries being arrested, we see purges of further nationalists and others who they believe to be sympathetic to the capitalist cause. And all of these were heightened as a result of the intervention within the Korean War.